Last but not least, our final speaker for today is Bernard Khoury. Bernard Khoury studied architecture at the Rhode Island School of Design in 1991. He then received a master's in architectural studies from Harvard University in 1993. He was then awarded in 2001 by the Municipality of Rome the honorable mention of the Borromini Prize given to architects under 40 years of age. In 2004, he was awarded the Architecture Plus Award. He is the co-founder for the Arab Center of Architecture. He was a visiting professor at the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, l'École Spéciale d'Architecture in Paris, and the American University of Beirut. He has both lectured and exhibited his work in prestigious academic institutions in both Europe and the US, including a solo show of his work given by the International Forum for Contemporary Architecture in Berlin in 2003, and alongside numerous group shows including U Prison in Turin in 2008, and Spazio at the opening show of the Maxi Museum in Rome in 2010. He was the co-curator and architect of the Kingdom of Bahrain's National Pavilion at the Venice Biennale's 14th International Architecture Exhibition in 2014. His work has been extensively, and I mean it when I say extensively, published by the professional press. Khoury started an independent practice in 1993 that over the years has developed an international reputation and a significant diverse portfolio of projects, both locally and abroad. Bernard Khoury, a very warm welcome for you.
Can we dim the lights? Okay. I'll start this lecture by bringing you back over 30 years ago. Back in 1991, I was in the comfort of my academic cocoon, still in grad school, and I had the chance to work with a great man, for those who know him, Lebbeus Woods. I was very interested in questions about architecture and war. He was very interested in what was happening in the Balkans, which were igniting their own wars back then. We were entering the so-called post-war period, post-Taif Accord, and like many others of my generation, we had great hopes for the great reconstruction project that we thought was going to take place. Obviously, it didn't happen that way. But with the distance and the comfort of the academic cocoon, I did an experiment and was assisted by Lebbeus Woods, who was my tutor at the time, worked on a project called Evolving Scars. So this is 1991. I'm 54 years old. It's 31 years ago. So I was like 22 years old. I was young, full of hope. I was a good man. And Evolving Scars is basically an experiment that tries to turn the demolition of buildings here, a generic ruin, because we were all focused on the former historical center of Beirut, which was a very symbolic project back then. So we look at this very generic ruin, which has no particular architectural importance. And the project starts with literally simulating the demolition of the ruin and the violence of war on buildings, which I should admit, at the time was something I was fascinated by, almost to the level of fetishizing the aesthetic of war demolition. Very dangerous, of course. It was important to move on. So the idea is to try to turn the demolition of the building, the physical memory, into an architectural act. See, it goes completely against the nature of our practice. We are trained to erect matter. But this was doing exactly the opposite. So it starts with sealing the ruin with a transparent membrane, framing it, and introducing this strange beast that you see suspended, which I called the memory collector. Back then, we didn't have any sophisticated computer software, so everything was done by hand. This was a huge concrete model that I photographed with 35 millimeter cameras. So if the demolition process didn't work, I had nothing left at the end of the experiment to show. So the intensity of demolition was proportional to the intensity of memory being collected by this beast. And you see that peripheral membrane gradually filling up with what I call the ashes of the building that were collected to form a new facade as the building was disappearing, was vanishing. This is it operating. And you can see the membrane getting almost to its point of saturation, at which point there's almost nothing left to demolish. And the black box, or the memory of the memory collector, would reach its limit, at which point the memory collector would start digging its own hole, and the whole structure would implode. So no physical memory left, but another kind of memory collected, which was immaterial. Again, we were fascinated by the aesthetics of disappearance and all of that. I look back at this project 31 years later, and I see to what extent it was politically naive. Politically naive because it aimed at, or it thought that it was possible to work on a collective memory, consensual memory, a form of history to be written post-war. Obviously, the years and the experience here taught me that this was impossible to do. We failed to agree on any sort of consensual history or collective history. But Evolving Scars still haunts me. We redrew it not long ago with digital media, and you can see the cockpit of the memory collector, its strange resemblance to the Apache helicopter, and my fascination with the military starts obviously way back. And you see here a very clear correlation between the built matter, the collected memory, and the demolished ashes. So as the building disappears, the ashes go up, and obviously the collected memory in megabytes and gigabytes reaches its point of saturation until the beast digs its own hole. And the anecdote here was that it would be the last archaeological layer beyond the 6 layers that we know under the city of Beirut, this one being no longer a material layer, but an immaterial one. So Evolving Scars haunts me 10 years later, literally 10 years later, in 2001, maybe the grandchild of Evolving Scars starts to take shape, but no longer in the comfort of an academic cocoon, certainly not in the context of any sort of memorial or architectural mission that aims at formulating any sort of serious history with a big H, but for the erection or construction of a restaurant and a bar, just that. So we were working on the supposed rehabilitation of a building. It's very interesting to see what the historical people, the preservation people, their take on preservation. To them, you have to keep the envelope intact, the footprint of the building intact. Whatever you do inside is not of any of their concern. So we did exactly that. And Central, in a way, is not about mummifying the ruin, certainly not, like many others were doing around in that neighborhood. It's not about drawing any sort of transvestite either, like many around were doing, but it was about the violence of the act, putting another animal behind the skin of that building, a completely different beast, a sort of a face-off operation. Central, in its initial setup, not the watered-down, sugar-coated version that is right now in the main hall. Central was one single table. For those of you who are very young, you might not remember, not have seen it, but it was one single pastoral table. It was a very pretentious space. And that table in the center of it had a staircase that brought the waiters down to the hall where they belonged, the kitchen. The waiters were trapped in the center of the table in this H-shaped circuit. And so they would never share the space of the patrons or the guests. And if you look carefully at the section, you'll see that the plane the waiters are walking on is 40 centimeters lower than the plane the patrons are sitting on, so that you would look down at them constantly. The chairs were extremely high. The setup was sort of immoral. So about a year and a half later, the management couldn't keep up with it, and we had to let go of the table. But it wasn't a restaurant anymore. So some people loved it, some people hated it. You could not talk to each other, you could only look at each other. And what you see here are not microphones, but they're pilot lamps that light up the plates that become reflectors. It was an intimidating space. It was not what I would call a peaceful, comfortable space to dine in, and it was very intentional. So the space had cathedral-esque proportions. It was about 9 meters high, 10 meters high, by 5 meters wide, by 17 meters in length. And floating above was the replacement of the roof, which was a tube that's 17 meters deep, at the end of which is a section of the bar that becomes an elevator that goes down. This is still there at this point. And this roof was built in situ. Like many of my early buildings, small-scale buildings, we tried to revive and reconnect with artisans, local artisans. So we built this thing, literally transforming materials locally. There were no imports whatsoever, all the way down to the window frames, the door handles. We did not buy anything from the markets. Obviously, we did not replaster the facade. We did not paint it in any sort of cute pastel color, but we let it rot behind steel wire mesh frames, and I call this the poetry of decay, the grandchild of evolving stars. The roof bar is still there, pretty much the same, except for the stupid terrace that they've added. But this was take two on the convertible buildings, which I was labeled at some point the architect of entertainment or convertible buildings. See, because people have to put a label on you. So this is it, closed or open, kind of like the lid of that thing you put your bread in the kitchen. The beams are circular, so they describe the circular movement of that roof that tilts, and basically half of it becomes into the hole below. Another improbable project, in my early years I was basically the architect of debauchery spaces, of entertainment. This is the first project I ever built. Most of you know it, it's still there. It was supposed to be there for only 5 years. It is now, I think, 25 years old. It was a temporary project. Like the first 6 projects I've built were all temporary. So they had an expiry date written on them before I even designed them, which is very strange because we architects are trained to think in permanence. Huh? We have a strange relationship with temporality. We're probably the last profession that is still very much stuck in the Stone Age, whether we manipulate concrete, steel, glass, or whatever, more contemporary materials. We're still in the Stone Age. Unlike many other medium today that produce meaning, we have a strange relationship with time. So strangely with Beirut, my first 6 projects were temporary, meaning they had an expiry date ranging between 5 to 9 years, which meant I knew at what date they would be demolished before I designed them. It's like a pregnant woman who's been told that the baby's going to die 5 years down the road. It goes against, again, the nature of architecture. But this temporal dimension of these projects gave me a certain freedom because I was in the here and now. I did not bear the load of permanence, which architects have a problem with, because by the time you're done with your building, by building it, sometimes it's 5, 6, 7, 8 years, the conditions of what we call context has changed. Obviously, context is not just the masses around you. Context is a far more complex issue. So with these projects, I was in the here and now, and I could be very radical in that sense. I wasn't worried about the future. I was in the present, firmly grounded in the present. And the other interesting dimension of entertainment projects is that they did not bear any sort of responsibility on the political level, like any institutional project would hold, such as a museum, a school, public housing, and so on. When you build a nightclub or a restaurant, you're not accountable politically for what you're doing. Nightclubs don't deserve architecture. They're usually given a basement under a building, or, you know. So I could take postures that I wouldn't have taken if I was serving an institution where you're supposed to be much more accountable when it comes to the meaning you produce. So Beirut offered me that in my early years. Again, the convertible structure, closed and open. It's a building that wakes up at night, sleeps during the day, completely invisible. And the interesting thing about this building is that I had never worked for any architect before, had no professional experience in the real sense of the term. So when I drew it and showed it to contractors, they dismissed me. So I did not resort to the construction industry. I worked with artisans. The main guy here is someone who was a coach builder who built garbage trucks. So for him, it was a piece of cake. The whole roof cost me $57,000, hydraulic pistons included, which was probably cheaper than any, or more affordable, than any stupid facade I would have bought off the shelf in terms of cost. So sleeping during the day, awake at night. BO18 wakes up, primarily at night it opens up because it doesn't have any neighbors. So we can make a lot of sound, and we don't have to worry about that. And my office, which is about 300 meters away, and we do work very late at night. Sometimes at 3, 4 in the morning, I hear boom, 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 the bass coming out of the hole. And I think that's the most fantastic thing about this project. So it's not the morbid story you hear. It's a project that is very much in the present. And I think it brings life to a neighborhood which still to this point is very toxic and has been bypassed by the city as it grew northbound. This is it in the early days, and this is it in the early hours of the morning. You can see the state of people, the guy passing out on the roof, the girl with her hand in her crotch, the other one leaving with someone she won't remember in the morning. So that's what I was known for, and they wouldn't commission me any serious buildings at the time. It took me a lot of time to get out of that. So, but before I got out of that, I did my last entertainment project in Beirut, Yabani, which was again on another problematic site. Yabani was very much about the impossibility of its existence on that particular site. For those of you who were around back then, in 2000, the Damascus Road, that stretch of it was still completely not rehabilitated. And the building next door was squatted by refugees, Syrian workers basically, who were living without handrails, without running water, without windows. And here we are, erecting a monument to eat sushi at $50 a pop or more. So there was something, again, very immoral about this commission. But then, you know, any reasonable architect would have turned his back to such a commission. But we didn't do that. We did exactly the opposite. And we tried to celebrate in quite a complicated way the absurdity of the proposition on that site. So Yabani really assumes its presence and starts to build conditions that are not so comfortable. Again, you enter the space through a vitrine at ground level that really puts you on the spot, and then you're sucked by the building that takes you down to the center of the plan, which is in the center of the bar, drawn with the precision of a Swiss watch. And you arrive smack in the center. Your only contact to the outside world is the sky, nothing but the sky. You're completely disconnected from the sour reality, which is literally behind the wall next door. So you can enjoy your sushi at $50 or $100 a pop to the point where it might not be so comfortable anymore. You went down through a circular room, which had two disproportionate couches that were framed, frames like picture frames, and you arrived down to the center of the bar. But see, temporality is very important in architecture, particularly in Beirut. Things move at quite an incredible pace. So here I was initially working in contrast and the absurdity of the condition next door, in the building next door. But then by 2011, we were closed, and then the building next door, in the meantime, got rehabilitated. The Yabani restaurant became a squat for Syrian refugees. So basically, history turned against me. And I think that the catastrophic end of Yabani is very much the product of of temporality and how context is impossible to frame on these grounds. But the kids love it, and you can see it, decomposing day after day, which I kind of like. So I have never worked on any institutional projects, and when I compare my career to that of my father, who was born in 1929, who started his career primarily, almost exclusively, working for public projects during the glorious 30 years post-independence, I did exactly the opposite. So I I started practicing in the mid-late 90s, at which point the concept of the nation state here has gone completely bankrupt. And if you still think and believe that architecture can be a political act, you have to find your ways, you have to find a plan B to do that here, because there are no institutional projects. There was no reconstruction project, but we aimed for and we waited for post the Taif Accord obviously never happened. So you have to find a plan B, and you have to try to find ways to produce meaning, hopefully in a pertinent way, not necessarily in the conventional political territories of architecture like our colleagues would do in Europe or in more stable environments, because there is no consensual history here. There are no institutions and no institutional projects. So you're going to try to find meaning somewhere else, and that's why I showed you this first wave of projects. It starts with a naive and innocent proposition of an architectural installation monument evolving scars, and then it goes through the entertainment industry trying to produce meaning in the most sour and complicated conditions. But not so long ago, we were invited to a competition for the Bema Museum, and I initially declined the invitation because I believed that no one was ready. We were not ready at this point for the museum, for the institution to begin with, because we simply were, nobody had the legitimacy at this point to even acquire works that would represent the modern era or even the contemporary era. So there's a serious problem here. I think the proposition of the museum, as one could conceive it in the West, simply does not apply here. So I declined initially, but a very good friend of mine who's very much aware of and has done a lot of work on modern art and contemporary art, he's an artist himself, Walid Raad, challenged me to do proposition with him, which we did in a very short period of time, and obviously we were disqualified. But we said, we called it stage 0, and we said no museum. So we kind of did not comply by the program of the competition, but instead we dug a hole, which would be the foundations of a future museum that might come if one day there's a nation-state project, if one day there's an institution that has the legitimacy to sort of compose a history that would be consensual. In the meantime, since we're not ready, we stick with the whole. We'd go as deep as possible into the guts of the terrain, and in that hole, and within the walls of the retaining walls of the hole, we would dig tunnels or small rooms that would be galleries that would be given, or basically would host the works of private collectors, which there are many here. And it's interesting because these private collectors, and there are many of them here, collect in a very different way than a museum would. Again, they're not accountable, and they're collections that are very contradictory one to another. None of them pretend to build history, but the collection of all these collectors, in fact, reflects very well the impossibility of a consensual history. And we thought that would be far more interesting. So we would give temporary galleries to these collectors in which we would show some of their collections. And to access that, we would build a scaffolding structure within the perimeter of the retaining walls and use temporary construction elevators to reach them, and would keep that whole until one day, or maybe never, we'll be ready to build a museum. The dinosaurs at the jury obviously disqualified us, and they preferred a project that complied with the program blindly. I call this a very dangerous naivete. But you know, this is how most of the architecture world operates these days. It is becoming more and more apolitical. But interestingly, Walid and I sold this work of art, and it has circulated probably far more, and even financially brought much more than what you would get in architectural fees at this point, at the level of a concept, and hopefully produced more relevant meaning relative to context. I've worked on Beirut on many occasions. This is a piece that was commissioned by the Maxi Museum for the opening of the new extension that was built by Zaha Hadid in 2010. Here we worked on mapping or pinpointing areas or sites that were fetishized in the so-called post-war period, and we tried to link these by a network, which we've imagined as sort of tracks, as a second layer above the city, as an alternative layer of movement, to offer an alternative, extraordinary experience for the curious tourist who could consume the city in a split second. So this is looking at it from one of the windows of the Murr Tower, and to circulate on that track, we've imagined a pod in which we would put the curious tourist, his head placed where the detonator of the bomb would be placed for the ultimate experience, and we've imagined zipping in and out of the Holiday Inn Hotel, another fetishized ruin in a split second. We built the damn thing. This is it exiting my office. We rolled it around the city, and my team was arrested by the Secret Services of the Army, and we were charged for planting evidence of weapons of mass destruction, which could have provoked another war that Sahel would wage on us. So I had to make phone calls to get my guys out of jail. So much for the Secret Services of the Army. Beirut is a city that is in constant convalescence. It kept haunting me, even in some of the more abstract works that we produce, sometimes outside the realm of our commissions. But then on a more serious architectural level, we've produced, you know, later on, after, I would say, after the years of 2008-9, back when the stock market, the world stock market was crashing here, we were living the peak of our real estate boom. So lots of commissions came. This is a building I completed, and these pictures were taken right before, just a week before the August 4th blast. The tallest building we've ever executed to this date. And these are the few photos I could shoot before it was very seriously hit by the blast. I'm showing you this building because even in the context of what is supposed to be a very corporate commission by real estate developers, so again, we're not in the conventional context in which you can produce political meaning in architecture, certainly not in the developer's architecture, but yet again, we managed to take and build with our developer a scenario that I thought was very much in tune with its context. And for me, this context is certainly not the beige Beirut or the so-called historical Beirut that forgot its history beyond 1943. It's very interesting to see that everything that qualifies as historical here is everything that was built by whoever invaded this territory. So the Mesopotamians, the Romans, you know, all the way to the Ottomans and the French mandate. That's history. But beyond this, beyond the independence, there's no history. It's very, very interesting. So to me, history is also the early days of modernism. History is the port, extremely important. And after the blast, I revisited the first presentation text I had written for this project, and it starts with Beirut is a port city. This building has a sentinel. It has all sorts of defense mechanisms on it. It's built like a fortress. you know, from its suicidal bridge, which is in fact a reflector aiming at the city center. Another project which was also very greatly affected by the blast is what they call the Skyline. I don't like its name, but it's a developer's name. I'd rather call it the Hunchback, the Transformer, whatever. But then again, this building completed in 2014 was very much in dialogue with the port. So much in dialogue with the port in such an arrogant way that it stood almost like it's like a guard watching over the port with its two cannons and its helmet above. Almost like its guardian angel or its guardian monster. But it is situated 300 meters away from the port limits, so you can imagine what's happened to it. Nothing was left besides the concrete skeleton, which remains stable. And the building next to it, which was also completed around that same time. Both are under rehabilitation. So we've worked on a project which is called Stitching the Skyline, in which I've proposed the owners not to rehabilitate it back in its original state, because that would be naive, and I don't like naive buildings. And we started by a very thorough survey of the panels that were, and they were all numbered on the as-built drawings, on the state of the panels, which were in 6 categories, from 1 to 6. And according to the category of the damage, from undamaged to completely vanished, we've built in a number of vertices from 1 to 6 on these panels, and according to their geometry and their proximity to one another, through a little tweak in the software, we were able to basically draw the vertices provoked by the blast, according to our survey, which was quite thorough, of the state of these panels. So it was a very laborious survey and a very laborious task to do that. But at the end of the day, the geometry of these vertexes were not drawn by me. They were drawn by basically the outcome of that software and that program we had done. And although this was purely analytical work, we've decided to take this and literally translate it into build form. And instead of putting back panels, we've decided to put des barreaux, steel rods, to basically mark the stitches of the facades. So the idea is that we'd move from that to that. And we've called it the stitching of the skyline, which would end up looking like this. It is now under construction. So one of the facades is almost complete. And we were able to perform this at around 65 to 70% the cost of what it would have cost us to replace the existing panels with some, crappy sandwich aluminum composite panels that would be imported from China. Instead, we took raw material and we transformed it here, and we had local artisans work on it. So the transformation of the material, which is in fact the bigger part of the cost of construction, was spent here instead of getting imported materials that are finished and to be assembled locally. I'd leave it at that, and I'll let you interpret what the limits of what we could do in at least in attempting to produce meaning with our medium as architects, our practice in an environment that initially does not give you the chance to do this, where you have to look for it in the most improbable places. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernard, for this very rich presentation. I myself have very specific questions to ask you. First off, I couldn't help but notice you talking about specificity and meaning throughout all your presentation. Were these two terminologies something that you took into consideration from when you started designing in your early projects?
Yeah, I'm obsessed with the specific, obsessed, literally. And I think if there's still room for any invention in our practice, it can only come in the specificities of a situation. I think the times of global certainties obviously are over. They've been over for quite a few decades now, and I think if you're not specific to the context, and I mean context not in the surface, not in the masses, but context in what is not so visible. If you don't manipulate these realities in a relevant manner, I'm not interested. I'm not interested in architecture as an autonomous discipline. I don't like cute buildings. I don't like good architecture. I don't like what's being published. I don't like what's being awarded. In fact, I was never really awarded. Everything you stated is not so correct. I never got an award in the real sense of the term. I don't fit I don't fit the profile. I'm not a good architect by today's standards, and I'm very proud of that.
And what about?
I'm not a trendy architect. I hate trends.
We all do, trust me. And what about sustainability? What do you think about sustainability when it comes to architecture?
It's becoming. It has been for the past years and decades. It has become a marketing term that's been abused and abused and abused. I think our grandparents were much more aware of the elements and manipulated, and worked with the elements much better than we do. So I'm very amused and at the same time a bit, annoyed to see, for instance, this label being overused in the Gulf countries to begin with, where you got to have they get these stars as good students.
Overused and abused.
Super overused and abused, and it's in fact most people who have nothing to say hide behind that, and it's the trend today. If you're not good, if you're not clean, you're not a good person. So I build very thin. All of my residential projects are very, very thin slabs. They're not deep slabs. I have never built a reception that doesn't have at least 2 orientations open, if not 3. I try to force it. Sometimes I land on outside. I avoid blind cores. They're very, very basic recipes that our grandfathers mastered extremely well, but I don't go and brag about it because I think it's something obvious. You have to do this. You don't even talk about it. It's something that is, that an architect should do naturally and shouldn't brag about. That is a given.
And what about other building typologies that you design? Is there any specific typology that you enjoy designing more than the others? And why is that?
I don't believe in typologies because, again, I wouldn't like to look at my entertainment projects as entertainment projects. In fact, I hope to pervert these programs into becoming something else. And I wouldn't like to see my residential projects looked as or judged only through the criteria of the residential typologies. In fact, when we started building, when we were recuperated by developers, and it started with young developers of my generation who were 2 or 3 very smart kids, we built these projects together. And they turned out to be, well, they were completely against the flow in terms of the fact that they did not comply with the standards of the industry. There were certain things you didn't do in residential development. There were recipes, in fact, catastrophic recipes that were reproduced for decades and decades. I think over 99%, and I'm weighing my words, it's much less than 1% of what was built on our territories in the residential market after the 1950s and 60s is catastrophic. They're very bad interpretations of the modern recipes that have gone sour, extremely bad. And it got worse and worse after the decade of the 1980s, all the way through the 2000s. Take any typical apartment in Beirut built during that period. You get out of the elevator at noon on the 15th of August. You have to turn on the lights to put your key into your door. we live in a Mediterranean environment. These might get the LEED certification because they comply by certain standards, but that's bullshit, and we know it. We don't do this. Most of these apartments have exactly the same typology. Go into an entrance, there's segregation, the public faces the family behind, the kitchen, the family room, and dark corridors and an extremely deep slab. I've never done this, I'll never do this ever. My balconies are sometimes forced circuits around the house that allow you to go from any point to any point without ever walking inside, if you wish to do so, and they're impossible to glaze. So those are things that are very much, address the environment. And if the building is clad in black, they'll tell you that I'm black, I'm not green. But that's their problem, not mine.
Yeah, of course it is. Bernard, in regards to the Hunchback building that was unfortunately severely damaged by the blast, you decided that you want to stitch the facade. As an architect, do you see that the silos that are present at the port should also be kept and addressed in any other manner, but most importantly kept or removed?
Well, I think no one can erect a memorial on this site, and I hope no one ever will, because no one has the legitimacy at this point to do so. Again, it's the impossibility to agree on a consensual history, the absence of any institutions that have any sort of credibility to take on that act. So this is impossible. It was impossible in the 90s in the so-called post-war period. It is certainly completely impossible today with, with the given political context as we know it, and the ruling political class that is completely bankrupt and corrupt and so on and so forth. So there is, for a monument, there needs to be an authority. There is no authority. There's a corrupt, incompetent, and I'm not going to continue, the insults. So authority and the nation state are totally bankrupt and gone. So the monument is an impossible proposition, just like the museum was an impossible proposition at this point in time. Yet it is there. I think the silos are a monument because they're an accidental monument. They're an imposed monument. They're there. We shouldn't touch them until we're ready, but we're certainly not ready at this point. And they're fascinating, just as they are. I don't think any architect I wouldn't have the courage to touch any, any cubic meter of stone on that site at this point in time. And I'm aware of the danger of fetishizing the ruin, but at this point, nobody has the legitimacy to do anything. And I'm very worried that at some point they'll nominate some idiot to do that.
Yeah, of course, as they usually do. Lastly, you previously initiated your presentation via a sentence, "I was young and full of hope."
Yes.
Are you still full of hope, Bernard?
Well, it's a different kind of hope. I think the reason why I'm still in Beirut and I enjoy Beirut is because it is a city that keeps us awake and incredibly alive. It is incredibly toxic, but it doesn't let you go to sleep. So, I go sleep in Manhattan, rest in Berlin, but I stay up here extremely awake until it consumes me, and I'll probably die 20, 30 years ahead of my time because it's extremely toxic, but it is a context that keeps you, in the forefront of the combat. And I look at my colleagues in Europe, my colleagues and my friends in Europe, and sometimes with a little smile because, they live in a sleepy, dormant environment. Their worries to me are completely irrelevant. We're literally at the forefront, in the most toxic, dangerous, catastrophic environment. And I think, just like a good medical doctor, you have to be right there at the forefront if you still believe that your practice can make a difference. And I still want to believe that. I'm not a cynical person. And I want to believe that I can do my share, my part, no matter how futile or irrelevant it might be for many people. But it doesn't matter. Architecture is no longer that very important act that it used to be up until the 19th century. Meaning is produced somewhere else through far more spontaneous and temporal means. But I want to believe that there's still space for us to do something.
Yes.
I might be very naive.
No, you're not.
I don't know.
And is there any specific message that you'd like to address to the youth now?
No.
Okay. Anyone from the audience would like to pose a question to Bernard? No? I think that's about it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.